Welcome to Microsoft Research Conversations in STEM. I'm Váleri Vásquez, a 2021 Microsoft Research PhD Fellow, doctoral candidate in the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley, and your host for today's panel discussion on medical and health technology. We have a lot to talk about, but before we get started, I want to remind you that we're planning to leave time for some of your questions at the end, and you can submit them via the Ask a Question button that's on the lower right corner of your Teams live interface. So now let me introduce our panelists and we'll get into our conversation. First, we have Dr. Emma Pierson. She's a senior researcher at Microsoft Research New England and also an incoming assistant professor of computer science at Cornell Tech in New York City. She develops data science and machine learning methods to study inequality in healthcare, and her work has been widely recognized in both academic and popular publications. Next, please meet Dr. Pashmina Cameron, a principal research manager at Microsoft Research Cambridge. She works on machine learning for drug discovery as part of the Health Intelligence Initiative, and her current interests include computer vision, natural language processing, graph neural networks, and optimization. Prior to her work in health intelligence, Dr. Cameron led the deep learning engineering team for machine intelligence in the UK lab. And finally, please meet Jina, a principal research software engineer in the Human Understanding and Empathy Group at Microsoft Research in Redmond, and a third-year PhD student in computer science at the University of Washington. Jina designs technologies and applies data science and machine learning to improve mental health and well-being, both in clinical settings as well as in the workplace. She also looks at large data sets to discern population-level shifts in well-being. Welcome to all three of you. So let's begin by talking big picture about the need for robust medical and health technologies for the 21st century. Why and how do you think technology, particularly machine learning and AI, is crucial in medicine and healthcare today? And what big problems can we come closer to solving through technology research and innovation? Emma, let's start with you.
Hi, yes, thanks so much for having me. So one of the directions I'm particularly excited about in terms of applying algorithms and AI and machine learning to healthcare is that we can use them to potentially reduce disparities, inequalities, by shedding light on the health of historically underserved populations. So we know, of course, our society remains profoundly unequal, our health systems remain profoundly unequal. COVID is exhibit A of this, but there are many other examples as well. We also know that algorithms used improperly can make this inequality worse, right? We see examples of this in natural language processing, right? Computers sort of associate men with computer programmers and women with homemakers. We see it in computer vision, myriad other examples. And there are examples of it in healthcare as well. But this hard and important truth shouldn't distract us from its more optimistic counterpoint. We know that algorithms can also reduce disparities, and there are multiple reasons for this. Many of the problems which affect algorithms also affect humans, and human decision makers also suffer from biases that algorithms do not. So to take one high-profile example of how algorithms can reduce healthcare disparities, we saw that a widely used algorithm used to predict health risks exhibits racial bias. This is work from Ziad Obermeyer and others. Black patients with a given risk score are sicker than white patients with the same risk score. Now, why did this happen? It happened because the algorithm was trained to predict cost as a proxy for health, and Black patients who had unequal access to care had less money spent on them than equivalently sick white patients. But there's also an optimistic end to this story, which is that when the authors identified this problem, there was also a relatively simple solution. Train the algorithm not just to predict cost, but also to predict health. And thereby, by changing the label, you're able to narrow this inequity. So this sort of illustrates both sides of this coin, right? How algorithms can increase disparities, but also with careful analysis can reduce them.
Thank you so much for that, Emma. Pashmina, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. So recent advances in AI and machine learning have led everyone to ask, well, what does it mean for healthcare, and how can we revolutionize healthcare using all these advances? To a certain extent, health
Oops, it looks like we've lost Pashmina for the moment. So just while she's frozen, how about we move on to you, Jina, and then we'll come back to Pashmina.
Hi, thank you for, first of all, having me here. So I guess there's been a lot of interesting advances in mental health technologies, I think, especially with the COVID pandemic. Mental health has been at the forefront of everybody's minds. So, starting from macro levels, now we have access to large scale, private and public data around people's behaviors and digital traces in a way that lets us study mental health at large scales so that we can identify and foresee mental health needs that impact certain populations. And in clinical space, we are applying data processing and machine learning technologies to data sets that were traditionally out of reach. So in terms of face-to-face psychotherapies, we can now do massive analysis on multimodal data from therapy sessions and conversations, online, offline, asynchronous, to understand what works and doesn't work and how it works, and to validate existing treatment technologies. We can also create natural experiments from existing data for testing clinical efficacy, or we can also expand treatment modalities beyond traditional sitting at a shrink's office by digitizing and discovering new ways of delivering mental health care, whether it's exposure therapy through VR, learning about mental health through Minecraft, or chatbots for suicide prevention. And these new innovative services are available not just to patients who are diagnosed, but those who may not have access to mental health care. And again, these services also provide rich data for discovering new phenomena, new treatments, new modalities for improving mental health care. And I think personalization is such an important area for mental health. The first thing you do when you seek help is to find the person that can build good rapport with you. And the whole treatment process is in discovering the right plan that will help you improve and maintain your improvement. So treatment that works for one person may not work for another person. It might take you 2 weeks, it might take you 2 years, and life also throws a whole bunch of challenges at you. So I see this as a never-ending discovery of treatment or support that works for you, and AI that learns about you can actually adapt therapy to fit your needs. And this is really crucial and ripe for innovation. So by doing personalization, system can also catch you in the moment and deliver just-in-time interventions on top of your regular scheduled interventions.
Of course. Thank you, Jina. Pashmina, I see that you're back. Do you want to try again? We lost the second half of your answer.
Yeah, let's have a go. Okay, so one of the most important problems in healthcare for now, even though it's not the most fancy problem, is just collecting all the data and ensuring that it's stored in a secure. It's important to have open standards for this so that we can all benefit from the collective data. And second problem that really interests me is using machine learning in life sciences, either to apply to chemistry in the context of drug discovery to create new drugs to treat health conditions, or to study how the human body reacts to certain kinds of treatments, or how to adapt the cells to then accept treatments that we develop. I'll be brief.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So, I mean, as clearly exhibited by each of those answers, you're each doing very interesting but different work in this field. So maybe you can share with the audience what inspired you to get involved in this research and why you chose the particular topic or the path that you're currently focused on. And maybe we can go in the same order again and hear from Emma first.
Sure, yeah. So basically I do healthcare and inequality in a nutshell. And my interest in healthcare is very much bound up in my own DNA. So I was always a math nerd, but when I was 20 or 21 years old, I found out that I carried a mutation that conferred a very high risk of cancer. And this is sort of scary and depressing news to get as a young person, of course, or at any age. And so I basically went from being a physics major and studying, cosmology and galaxies to getting really interested in cancer biology. And then, from there, that sort of drove my whole trajectory. My interest in inequality, I think it started as being sort of, my experiences as a woman in heavily male-dominated fields, and then it sort of broadened from there to other, dimensions of inequality, racial, socioeconomic, et cetera. But in general, my interest in both healthcare and inequality has been very much guided and shaped by my own experiences. And in general, I prefer to work on problems that are sort of emotionally, not just intellectually compelling to me, and both those areas are.
Thanks for that. Pashmina, what about you?
Yeah, so growing up, I was mostly interested in maths because I could tell if I got the answer right, whereas with biology and chemistry, it was a bit more abstract. So I found the uncertainty quite unnerving. And then I went into engineering, studied computer vision. But when I came to Microsoft, one of the computer vision projects that I did was Project Inner Eye, which tries to detect tumor boundaries in MRI and CT scan images of cancer patients. And there I was sort of using the same toolkit as I was used to before for other applications, but I could see that I could use this toolkit to make such a difference in the space of healthcare. So that really motivated me to consider this new area. And then there was a visit to a hospital where I got to see how each stage in the care pathway works. And again, there I could see how simple changes or simple machine learning systems could make a really good impact in this area. And then I started questioning why I was doing the things that I was doing and whether that is the right thing for me to do. And this is where I started embracing the abstract and uncertain picture of the world. And I started getting comfortable in a multidisciplinary scenario. I started thinking, okay, interesting stuff to do is to ask the right questions, not necessarily just find solutions to a question that is already known.
That is so inspiring. Jina, I'd love to hear from you next.
Thank you. I think, Emma, you and I have a commonality. I also studied physics before I came into this field. Okay, so I had been a UI developer before I went into research. So, and one of the reasons why I went into research was to understand how and why designs work. So my first project in research was around interactive machine learning, or human-in-the-loop machine learning. And it was really fascinating to me at the time that, rather than crunching numbers through algorithms and getting an answer after some time, you have this short interactive loop, almost like a dialogue between the person and the model. It's kind of like how you write code these days. Writing code in an interactive environment is like having a dialogue between you and the compiler. So we called it machine teaching, where the goal is not to build a better learner, but the goal is in machine teaching is to have a better teacher or the model builder. So, how can we better leverage the knowledge that the humans have? What's the interaction language to facilitate this knowledge transfer? How do we help humans gain knowledge in this process, which then you can put it back into the model, and then the resulting model is better than the model built from traditional kind of batch processing method. And so from what I learned from machine teaching, I started to look for practical areas of application where, this close, meaningful relationship between the person and the model would be crucial. And health was that one area, especially around chronic diseases where, things are not so clear cut and the contextual understanding about you is so much more important. So up until this point, I had always assumed that machine learning is a key part of my research. But as I started to dig into various problems and really understood the context, there were way more human problems than machine learning problems. So one thing that I decided to do was to avoid being solution-centered and be more human-centered, meaning I had intentionally put machine learning and AI as an afterthought. And that's when I had the opportunity to look at cancer and depression comorbidities and the breakdowns that occur in the current care practices. And I also had my own kind of ongoing struggles with my own depression. And as I learned more about depression and psychosocial care in these contexts, I realized how, mental health care, whether you're diagnosed or not, has always been deprioritized over other things, your physical health, your work, or your family. So my research path has always been since then in figuring out how do we prioritize mental health care? How do we give people the time and resources to take care of themselves when life is demanding so much? So now part of my work is in tying these design challenges back to my machine teaching roots, where, I'm confident that AI can be a crucial collaborator in helping you discover, your goals that stick, understand your current behavioral patterns or patterns you might want to break, or discover interventions that work for you and stick. So I'm really super excited about this space because, personally, I deprioritize my mental health. So I'll be my worst customer for my own research output, but also it's about time that we actually practice whole person healthcare, which we talk about all the time, but I don't think it's ever really realized. And I think it starts with raising the importance of mental health and contextual understanding of the person.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Jina. And I'd like to get into a little bit more detail with you as the interview goes on. But now let's speak in a little bit more detail about each of your individual research. So Pashmina, let's start with you. Healthcare is a major focus of the Microsoft Research Lab in Cambridge. And as we mentioned earlier, there's an initiative there called Healthcare Intelligence. And I was wondering if you could just share a bit with us about your work there, and in particular, Jina's mentioned the trend towards personalization. So it might be interesting to hear how you think about machine learning for drug discovery and how it might be impacted by that trend towards personalization. How does it affect traditional clinical trials, and what implications does it have for AI approaches in your experience? Oh, Pashmina, you're muted. There you go.
Bingo. Okay, so the mission for the healthcare intelligence team at Microsoft Research Cambridge is to try and realize the tremendous potential that AI has in revolutionizing healthcare, and in to do that, we sort of try and follow three principles. First is we try and have multidisciplinary teams, because it's really important to not only have machine learning experts, but also social scientists, engineers, designers, domain experts in the loop from the start. The second principle we follow is to make sure that everything we do is compliant right from the start. We first start with a review in terms of compliance, and then make sure that we build systems that are trustworthy and follow Microsoft's responsible AI principles. And this is important because whatever we develop needs to be practically implementable. And then the third thing we realized is that it's really important to partner with domain experts and people who are in the business of delivering healthcare solutions, because it's one thing to develop something in the lab, but if you haven't looked at the full picture, the solutions you develop are not ones that can actually be accessible to people broadly. And then in terms of what I do, I'm currently leading a project on drug discovery, and I'm really excited by the project because chemical spaces are vast and complex, and developing new drugs needs evaluation of hundreds of thousands of candidates at several clinical trial stages. And the process is slow and costly and requires immense amount of expert time. And as they say, the most important resource we have is expert time. So the aim of the project is to make this process efficient while making sure that the drugs developed are still very effective. So in terms of personalization now, I think it would be good to talk about three different aspects. First is, can we have truly personalized drugs? So here we accept that the state of biochemical interactions in the human body are as they are, and what we're going to try and do is figure out what drug might cure a certain health condition. And now we're honestly a little way away from having truly personalized off-the-shelf drugs, but there are certainly very interesting efforts underway to study the effects of environmental and genetic factors at a population level or a group level. And the main drive, as mentioned before, right now is in ensuring the efficiency and efficacy of the drug discovery process. But if we are able to do this in a data efficient manner, then I think that's going to move us closer to being able to develop personalized drugs or personalized treatments. The methods that we're using currently are still quite young, and so it's going to take us a while to get there. Not just because the machine learning isn't as advanced, but also because the data available for the later stages of drug discovery is quite deficient in the sense that it's actually really difficult and expensive to collect such data. And then when the data has been collected, it's not necessarily openly available for everyone. So inherently, there are these challenges that we have to tackle. But there are other areas where personalization is being quite effective. And I'll take two examples. The first one is in immunomics. Here, the aim is to study, is to observe how the cells in the body behave and adapt the treatment to fit the way the body is functioning. So Microsoft Immunomics is a partnership with Adaptive Biotech, and they take precisely this approach. What they do is they take 1 milliliter of blood sample, and that typically has about 1 million T cells. And then using immunosequencing, we can sequence the T cell receptor gene, which tells you exactly how, exactly which antigens the T cells are going to recognize. And this prediction is a machine learning problem. So using this combination, if we know how the T cells are going to recognize the antigens, we can develop highly targeted treatments. And this seems to work for diagnosing various diseases like cancer or infections or oncology, cancers again, but also autoimmune diseases. The third example, which is really exciting, is that in synthetic biology. And here the idea is to say, okay, well, what we're going to do is not just accept how the body behaves or even try and observe and then adapt it. But what we're going to do is take some cells and reprogram the cells to do what we want them to do in order to fight disease. So there's a project called Station B, and research on this project has been going on for a decade now because it's highly challenging and, well, telling the cells what to do tends to be quite difficult. But we're partnering with Oxford Biomedica and Novartis in this area, and they've secured this deal to create a treatment that reprograms the patient's own immune cells. Now, this treatment is highly personalized because you start with cells from an individual, and the treatment also only works for that individual, so it's specifically developed for that individual. The success rates are also great. So you can go from children who've got maybe weeks to live to them going into remission after the treatment, and around 80% is the efficacy.
Wow.
Now, the problem is that the treatment costs about $500,000, but it exists and it cures things like leukemia and lymphoma. So to make progress on personalization, what we want to focus on is not just the machine learning, but also the mechanism of delivery, because in the end, the delivery mechanism determines whether or not the treatments are equally accessible to everyone, and that is really important. It's great to solve really complex problems, but we also need to keep track of whether everyone has access to these solutions.
Of course. Wow, there's so much there. Thank you, Pashmina. I've got so many follow-up questions. I think we might move to Emma, given that you mentioned this, healthcare access and equity question. Given that Emma's interests include healthcare technology as well as issues of equality across populations. So a big problem relevant to machine learning in this area is actually data quality and availability, which is something that Pashmina also mentioned. For example, representative data collection. So is there a way, Emma, that you think that we can quantify and flag sort of the concrete risk that this presents for clinical applications? And more generally, are there other problems relevant to equality in healthcare where you think certain technologies can either make a difference in identifying or in solving them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as Pashmina flags, diversity in data sets and representative data sets, are crucial. And I can tell you a story about this actually from my own recent work. So we were studying knee osteoarthritis, which is one of the most common causes of disabling pain in older adults. Like someone listening to this talk is going to get knee osteoarthritis if they don't already have it. And basically, there are racial and socioeconomic disparities in knee osteoarthritis pain, where patients from underserved racial and socioeconomic groups experience greater pain. And the interesting mystery here is that this pain gap persists, even when you control for how severe the doctor thinks the disease is, as measured by looking at an X-ray of the knee. So why is this? Why is there this pain gap? Well, one possible explanation is that there's stuff outside the knee, like greater life stress, which is causing these groups to experience greater pain, even when their knee disease is no more severe. But there's a second possibility, right? And that's that there might be pain-related factors within the knee that are not captured by standard measures of knee severity, but that would explain these underserved groups' greater pain levels. So we use a machine learning approach to try to distinguish between these two hypotheses by training a deep learning algorithm to try to predict the patient's pain from the knee x-rays. And we find that this algorithm does find additional signal within the knee for predicting pain, and that when you control for the algorithm's severity score, it reduces racial and socioeconomic disparities in pain by 2 to 5 times more than controlling for clinical severity measures. And here's the important link back to the diversity of the data set. We show that the racial diversity of the data set that we trained our algorithm on contributes crucially to our results. We do an experiment where we remove all the Black patients from the data set, and we find that the results of the algorithm are not as good in terms of its ability to narrow the pain gap. And furthermore, it's plausible that the reason that the original clinical score didn't do a great job of narrowing that pain gap is because it was developed on heavily white British populations. So here's a case, in explaining pain where diversity of the data sets you're looking at is clearly crucial. To take a second example where diversity of data sets really matters, people are now interested in developing risk scores for cancer and other diseases based on someone's genetics. So these are called predictive risk scores, things like this. So if you have dangerous cancer mutations, we could maybe redirect you to screening and stuff like this because we know you're at high risk of cancer. The problem is these risk scores are known to perform worse in non-European populations. And why is this? It's because they've been developed on databases like the UK Biobank, which skew heavily European, and so they disfavor other populations. So how do we fix this problem, right? One solution to this is very obvious and unavoidable and difficult, and it's better data collection, right? But I think there's also an important role for machine learning researchers in terms of designing algorithms which are more robust to distributional shifts and which perform well on minority populations within the data. So I don't think it's enough to just be like, oh, we need better data, we have no role as machine learning researchers. No, there are also algorithmic practices which can potentially mitigate these biases. And one important contributor to these is basically the development of benchmark data sets which compile distribution shifts so that you can test how well your algorithms perform and develop algorithms that are more robust to these distributional shifts. I want to close, though, with a piece of good news here, which is that increasingly people are recognizing this and trying to collect data sets that are, which better represent minority populations. To take another example of this from my own work, we've worked a lot with creators of women's health apps, which basically collect data on the menstrual cycle and other features of women's health. And as a consequence, when you amass these data sets, which are sort of tracking patterns in millions of women from all over the world, you can do a lot better and go beyond done sort of studies in the past which have looked at like, small populations of undergraduates at like, colleges within the United States and stuff like this. And by sort of combining that with, big data techniques, you can find patterns that previously were uncovered. So I do think this is an optimistic story. Yes, data set bias is a serious problem, but people are increasingly recognizing it. They're collecting more diverse data sets, and combined with powerful advances in machine learning and AI, we have the ability to go beyond sort of the practices in the past and do a better job of shedding light on the health of underserved populations historically.
Well, thanks for that encouraging takeaway. Jina, I want to turn to you because much of the research in medical and health technology is aimed at improving diagnoses and interventions for physical ailments like the ones that Emma was just describing. But your research focuses on using technology to improve mental health and well-being. So tell us a little bit about what's going on in the broader field of human understanding and empathy. It would be great to hear about the effort to bring emotional intelligence to technology. You've spoken a little bit about it already, and as well as about the work that you're doing for people with terminal illnesses and depression. One related observation that you sort of mentioned tangentially in your earlier answer, if you have time to address it now, is that having humans in the loop can improve the quality of machine learning predictions and ensure ethical conduct. But the mental health space is increasingly opening to fully AI-based interaction. So can you reflect a little bit on the benefits and the detriments that you might see in that?
Thanks, Valerie. So start from the beginning. So I think your point about physical health focus is a very important one. There's been a lot of research that outlines the importance of mental health, obviously for physical health, whether it's correlation or causation, that's debatable. But one thing is for sure is that we need to think about the whole person. There are actually so many systematic and public health issues that stem from this kind of disease or physical health centered view, especially around health insurance or reimbursements or financial aid services. This financial piece is such a barrier because not only is mental health care deprioritized in the health systems, it is also invested in less because it doesn't bring in as much revenue, at least in the cancer care context. So this attitude actually bleeds into health technologies, where I think many of my colleagues that practice psychology and psychiatry have said that the current electronic health record systems don't have native support for psychosocial care, and that they usually have to have some hacked up solution or having to beg their IT departments to add something. So when we think about technologies for mental health, we're not just talking about Headspace app. We're talking about technologies that support healthcare systems and beyond. We're talking about accessible technologies for people all along the full spectrum of mental health needs. So in this kind of broad space of technologies for mental health and well-being, our group, Human Understanding and Empathy, is focused on systems that have a rich understanding about a person's context and physiological and behavioral patterns. Like human emotions are so fundamental to how we perceive the world and how we interact with the world. Emotions pretty much dictate our readiness to participate or withdraw from the world. It can distort our thoughts or motivate us to act. And obviously we can't know a person's internal emotional state, and that's even hard for me to understand for myself. So instead, we're building a system that is aware of externalized signals and tries to reason about them and use that information when interacting with the person. So essentially what a human being naturally does with emotional intelligence. So in this space, we're currently focusing on workplace stress. And one key component in our line of stress research is in this sensing and contextual understanding. So we capture physiological signals like heart rate, respiration, behavioral signals like facial expressions, nonverbal cues, voice tone, speech sentiment. Specifically around the workplace context, we capture behavioral and contextual signals like, are you alone? How long are you sitting at your computer? How frequently are you context switching between applications? How many meetings do you have? Do you have any breaks? Do you read emails as soon as you get them? Who do you collaborate with and things like that? And then the next component is in intervention. So what do we do with all these sense signals? We can make sure that the system we build is interacting with the person while being more considerate, polite, empathic, and so on. But we can also time interactions or interventions appropriately according to the sense data. And based on kind of historical data And currently in first state of the user, we can suggest healthy breaks, we can reduce distractions, we can suggest relaxation after stressful meetings, or provide unobtrusive changes to the environment for more kind of just in time in the moment interventions. So changing the brightness of the screen slightly to help you breathe better, things like that. So we can also help people plan ahead and of course schedule tasks around typical moments of focus, because now we know when you're more likely to be focused, and avoid stressful meetings because we know which meetings are stressful now, and then schedule breaks after one in advance, and most importantly, help you carve out time for yourself. We can also monitor passive signals as well as self-reports to ensure that these things are effective. And the last component is in reflection. So we have some basic understanding about common stressors and stress responses, but we actually need humans' help in making sense of the data we collect for that specific individual. So the system can present data it's captured, but it'll also give people agency and control over what the system should do with that information, and people can also correct mistakes. So these are kind of the main areas of research in our HUE group. And outside of the workplace context, I'm also interested in the clinical context as well as the national context, where I kind of try to ground my research around the fact that people are not just about their illness or their work or the COVID-19. We all wear different hats. We have many complicated personal journeys, and we need to continuously weigh different demands and needs against the limited resources we have. So in the context of cancer and depression, which is the clinical context that I'm working in, it's pretty clear that the system, the incentives, the training, the technology, and the stigma all work against putting mental health first. So you have this traditional cancer care that has certain care processes that patients go through. You have traditional psychosocial care that has its own care processes, and they're designed to account for each other. So when a patient has to navigate both cancer and mental health care, we find that patients with depression end up falling through the cracks. So we're studying this one care model called collaborative care, which is integrating behavioral health care directly into the physical health care settings like primary care or cancer care in my case. It's shown to work well in these care settings, but it also falls short if the system doesn't engage patients into their depression care. And then we found many technology opportunities in this space. Cancer care is extremely burdensome to patients, so our goal is to make psychosocial care more accessible through technology. So, for example, we're designing patient registries specifically for tracking patients with psychosocial care needs for more proactive outreach and monitoring. We're delivering, digitized psychosocial treatments so that patients can engage in care at the comfort of their home, or, they're in infusion suites. Or, if they have appointments that can't go to because they're too sick to come in, we can deliver these interventions. Then we're using this engagement information also to inform the next session and treatment adjustments and so on. And on the other side, psychosocial care services within cancer contexts are extremely under-resourced. So again, we use technologies to streamline this process and also improve the care delivery. So for example, there's a lot of action planning that happens during a psychosocial therapy session, which is not well captured at all by either the patient or the care provider. So, which is crucial to psychosocial therapy. And any technological advances in documentation and follow-throughs would be beneficial here. So these are the kinds of things that we're currently designing. And your point about human in the loop. So as I'm becoming more familiar with this space, it's been worrisome that people are just jumping to AI thinking that it'll solve all of the mental health problems. Mm-hmm. But I think what we really need to ask is, why do we need AI and technology for mental health? And it's been such a crucial question for mental health because it's so sensitive and there's potential misuses of AI. And we actually need to understand what function AI plays and understand the power dynamic that we inadvertently create within the socio-technical system. So we can do a lot of cool things with AI, but we need to be very careful. And I think the best AI system is not the one that replaces humans, obviously, but one that knows when and where to hand off to humans. So there are places where fully AI-based interactions are acceptable, like intake chatbots or non-critical information needs. But for predictive diagnoses, we have to be super careful, like Emma was saying. There's the automation bias, obviously, but humans are also biased. And our understanding on mental health diagnoses doesn't generalize to everyone. Turns out it was trained, it was most of the psychological research has been done on, white college students. So how are we going to ensure that we don't perpetrate biases? Once you're misdiagnosed with a mental health condition, it's really hard to get out of it, and the patients have to pay the price, and sometimes for life. It affects their jobs and everything else that follows. If we make mistakes as humans, it means we don't know the absolute ground truth. So how will we possibly build an AI system that can diagnose and work better? So do we even know what it means to work better? So I think the best way to have humans in the loop in this process is to be human-centered. So, following human-centered design processes to arrive at your AI solution. And as part of this process, you'll engage the right mix of stakeholders, preferably people that you tend to misrepresent, or including the very people that you're trying to help, right? And they'll have a lot to say about ethics and privacy. And I've heard a lot from our patients that I've interviewed around ethics and privacy. So, and there's always going to be this tension, and your researcher gut is saying like, oh, this is so complex and so tricky. And this is actually where you need to step up. And I've seen a lot of people try to make mathematically convenient assumptions around machine learning. And it's really easy to do that, but we really need to lean in and question our assumptions and really try to understand these tensions. So I think the best design is the one where you give the users the tools to guide the AI. So again, human in the loop. And I'm a huge proponent of embedding these interaction technology and teaching tools into the AI system, so we can collaboratively improve with the AI.
Thank you. You even anticipated a couple of follow-up questions I had there about ethics and human and AI biases sort of like feeding back on each other. So maybe we'll move on. And before we take questions from our audience, I'd like to get each of our panelists to take some time to sort of recap some of the most promising or important new ideas that you find in your fields, where the lines of research are both exciting but could use a lot of help from emerging researchers like the members of our audience. Should we start again with Pashmina?
Sure. So in addition to developing novel drugs to target new diseases or health conditions, I think we can do a lot in terms of studying the side effects of the existing drugs and seeing how combinations of drugs affects the treatment or the efficacy of each drug. We can also do a lot more in terms of studying patient histories at population level and group level in order to then have some tools to and then in terms of synthetic biology, I think what's really exciting if we have.
Oh, Pashmina, it seems like your audio is cutting out again.
Great understanding.
Pashmina, I'm sorry. I think we might have to come back to you. It sounds like your audio is cutting out again, but maybe we can segue to Emma and then try again.
Sure. Yeah, I can try and answer the question briefly. So, as stated, I'm very interested in health equity, and I want to just mention that this is not just a matter of equity or justice, right? It's also about like, where is there signal left on the table, right? We're statisticians, so we like chase signal, and I think so much effort has been devoted to sort of making the lives of privileged people better that like it's hard to find things that people haven't already found, and like there's a gold mine of potential discoveries if you look at populations that have historically not been studied as much. It's less crowded. I like uncrowded areas. One specific area I'm very interested in the moment is intimate partner violence, because it is astonishingly pervasive. And so if you have ideas in this regard for how a technologist can be helpful, please reach out to me. Specific questions that might be interesting and that people are working on and that are exciting are, can we find ways to detect it earlier? Can we evaluate how well these risk assessments for intimate partner violence are performing and whether they perform equitably across populations? Can we get better estimates of how pervasive this is because it's incredibly underreported? Can we as technologists prevent people from having their own technology used against them when their partners surveil them? these questions, many other questions, please reach out to me if you have ideas in this regard.
Thank you. Pashmina, it looks like you're back. Do you want to speak again about how emerging researchers can contribute to these areas?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how much we caught from the last spiel, but let's have a go again. So I think what is really exciting is that if we're now at a stage where we can go down from a whole course of chemotherapy to one intravenous injection, then I think the really exciting path forward injection to maybe one pill, and then continuing to do this for as many more health conditions as we can, because again, that is going to help us with the delivery mechanism and help us address inequality in terms of access to healthcare. The other area that I think is going to be huge in terms of impact is synthetic biology. If we can truly understand how cells work, and this is really hard, it's going to keep us busy for decades, but potentially it opens up a door to alternatives to plastic that are biodegradable, or crops that are can adapt to different growing conditions, maybe an AI-powered green revolution too, or something. But yeah, these are the sorts of problems that I think are really exciting. There aren't enough people working on those, and they're super hard, so they could really use your help.
Wonderful. Jina, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned personalization a lot. So, but I think personalization is important because it's actually helping empower people to kind of take control of their own mental health care. And along this thread of empowering people, I think there's an opportunity for AI to be used in a way that makes human connections more meaningful. So peer support is one of those areas where it's been an important concept in mental health since, like, anti-psychiatry movement in the 1960s, and people helping each other is at the core of mental health care. So can we use AI to enhance that? There's been actually work done in our lab by Ashish Sharma, and his team is building empathy rewriting models that can detect levels of empathy in online peer support contexts and help supporters respond in a way that's more empathic. So it is improving human connections and future interactions through this process. And there are others who are actively working on how to match volunteers with people who call into crisis lines, so that the support seekers feel more comfortable and can relate to the volunteers. So searching the right therapist or right person to talk to is really hard when you're in distress. So this area of research where we're enabling people to be more effective and help each other and make these meaningful connections is a great area of research for AI, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. And I know there are a lot of questions from our audience that are sort of following up on various aspects that you guys have spoken about already. One of the most popular actually pertains to the very relevant current issue of COVID-19. The question that many people have asked in some form or another is, how does data science and machine learning factor in delivering COVID-19 specific medical assistance to poor, underserved communities, whether in rural towns, urban areas, and how does this encompass testing, tracking, tracing, as well as post-hospitalization care of COVID-19 patients and their households? So I leave it, this could be answered by any of you, but I think it has elements, especially for Emma, in terms of the equity questions.
Yeah, I can speak to that based on some of our own recent work. So we have a recent Nature paper led by Serena Chang and others at Stanford where we look specifically at this equity question. And specifically what we do is we take data on human mobility, anonymized aggregated data on where people move, and we use it to understand why are there higher infection rates in lower income and non-white neighborhoods in the United States. And one of the things we find is that mobility is a crucial contributing factor. People from these neighborhoods, they have have to go out more, they're not as able to stay home, in part because of occupational differences, and therefore they're exposed to higher risk. And when they do go out, they go to places that are more dangerous because they live in areas that are more crowded. So like the grocery stores they go to are smaller and more dangerous. So on the one hand, this is a depressing finding. On the other hand, it's almost optimistic. You can tell I'm kind of an optimist because it suggests that these disparities are not set in stone, right? We can potentially affect mobility policy, right, by making it easier for people to stay in, maybe by delivering food or by delivering PPE so that when they do go out, they're exposed to lower risk. And so I think that's one of the ways that big data can kind of lend insights here. It can help us sort of understand the forces that are contributing to the dramatic disparities in infection rates that we're observing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think there are a number of questions, so I think we'll move on to try and get as many as we can. Do either of you want to speak to the trade-off between model performance and interpretability in healthcare? And related to sort of like a second related question is discussing the generalizability of machine learning algorithms across bimodal or multimodal populations as we identify more niche subpopulations who respond differently. And now that question has disappeared from my queue, but I hope you got the idea of what the person was trying to ask.
Jina, do you want to answer since I answered the last question? Or I can talk.
Yes. So trade-off between interpretability and performance. So I don't know, personally, I feel like performance metrics for machine learning models is kind of a, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like I don't have full faith in performance metrics, meaning that it's a metric that somebody came up with and set in line, and then everyone tries to beat it, right? Like the accuracy or whatever. But it depends so much on your training data, your test distribution. You know, how do you actually know that your test set is real representation of what you're going to see in the real life? There's so many issues around that I feel like, you know, yes, you can achieve 0.99% accuracy, but does it really mean that in real life? So I would personally favor interpretability. So if I can understand that there are certain areas that my model makes mistakes in, maybe it's biased in that it favors one population over another. As long as I know that I can make executive decisions, because I also, as a trained doctor or trained psychologist, I have opinions and I have my own expertise too, and I can incorporate that and work with the model, work with what the model knows. So, you know, often when we try to design AI systems, we have this assumption that the AI is going to be perfect, and it doesn't always work and almost always fails. I think you have to build in these ways to expose the mistakes that the AI is going to make, or expose the areas that it's lacking, so that the people that are leveraging it can actually work with it. So it's like getting handed a brand new puppy, right? You have no idea what it likes, how it reacts, right? You kind of have to figure out how it works before you can actually, have fun with it, right? Like, do you really want a black box model or a model that's perfect? Maybe perfect for somebody else is not perfect for you. So in that regard, I think we definitely need to make the assumption that all AI systems will fail at some point, and it has to be interpretable from the very beginning.
Thank you. I think actually, following up on your comment about sort of like the importance of expertise and sort of topic area scientific background, one of the questions that we have from our audience is, how should a pure science student go about gaining knowledge in machine learning and other such technologies in healthcare? Do you have any recommendations in terms of coursework or internship opportunities or experiences that they should pursue to augment their topical area knowledge with these kinds of understandings? And maybe Emma, as a newly minted professor, you have some particular insights to share on this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in some ways I feel old. Like I never took a formal deep learning class because like TensorFlow was invented while I was in PhD program. So it's kind of crazy how fast the field moves. I guess I'd give two pieces of advice. The first is that I think at least some rudimentary coursework is pretty useful before you just jump into doing stuff yourself. Because if you haven't sort of learned the basics of like, regression algorithms, classification algorithms, it's hard, it's hard to sort of do anything interesting. So I think, taking basic classes, your intro to machine learning class, maybe an intro to deep learning class, that's pretty essential. But I also think on top of that, really the fastest way to learn a lot of this stuff is by doing it. And so I think, I found doing Kaggle competitions useful because like making stuff work is really hard. Doing research can be useful as long as you're working in a lab where they sort of prioritize your development as a researcher and aren't just treating you as grunt work. I think blogging can be helpful because it teaches you to sort of churn out final products in a short time frame, and like doing blogging on data science and all these things were helpful to me. Yeah.
Fantastic.
I have one more to add to Emma, and I think I need to learn a lot from Emma, first of all. But I tend to like, in terms of gaining subject matter expertise outside of machine learning, in the health context and other domains, I've found working in projects where the project leads or the writers or whatnot are interdisciplinary. Those projects tend to work really well, and you get to learn so much from your collaborators. So I tend to look for those kinds of projects more than just purely machine learning or purely HCI projects.
Okay. I would totally second that. Like you got to work with doctors and stuff in medicine because you're just flying blind otherwise. I mean, it's like impossible.
As an interdisciplinary PhD student myself, I find this very encouraging. So, and actually it leads to another question from our audience, which do you have undergrad programs that you suggest for someone who's interested in developing innovations in this space? So it sounds like these multidisciplinary avenues are a way that you would recommend. Is there any other recommendations you would give for someone trying to choose their college major?
There are internship opportunities at Microsoft too. Oh, I think Pashmina had her hand up. On top of kind of the research opportunities that you normally get in your schools.
That's great. Okay, well, we have reached the end of our time. So I want to thank the audience for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation. I know I have, and I've learned a lot from you both, and I'm sorry Pashmina had to drop off. But I want to leave the audience with a quick reminder that you can access a recorded version of the panel discussion on the Microsoft Research YouTube channel in the coming days. So thank you all again, and goodbye.
Thank you for inviting us. This was fun. Goodbye.
Thank you.